So, the purpose of this module is to educate us on communication methods with the FDA, particularly as they pertain to the development of medical devices. A lot of these will pertain to pharmaceutical and biologics development as well. But for the most part, we're going to focus on those avenues that depend on medical devices. And a lot of this is to demystify some of the processes in explaining also how the FDA will help companies come to agreed upon terms on how they go about doing their testing. I think a lot of people somewhat assume that companies somewhat naively submit a packet of documents and kind of hope for the best. And a lot of times that is kind of true, or a lot of that has true roots within the history of the FDA. But there's been a lot of changes instilled in the past few decades to help companies understand exactly what the FDA expects before the submission process even happens. So let's dive into it. I'll first touch on some key piece of terminology that I think is necessary to understand a little bit about this history. So when companies are pursuing any pre-market submission, a big pivotal moment is going to be the investigational device exemption that has applicability in a lot of the different pathways for medical device development. Now, the investigational device exemption has its roots in core laws that ban all testing on humans for any kind of investigational or novel proprietary non-approved device. This applies to drugs and biologics as well. But you can't test on humans. That is, unless you get an exemption by the governing body, the FDA. So whenever you want to do research on humans with medical devices, you need an investigational device exemption that grants you that exemption from the ban on testing in humans. So it's a critical part. Anytime you need to do clinical trials on a medical device, you need this IDE in order to do that. Now, in order to get IDE, you need to convince the FDA of certain performance metrics that this will not only be functional, but has some indications of potentially showing some improvement to methods or efficacy as it pertains to the device. And also that it has a lot of safety factors built in. It's not going to pose a risk to the patients, or at least as minimal risk as possible in order to do those tests. So it's going to require extensive benchtop performances. You're going to need a lot of biocompatibility testing. You might even need certain human factors testing to understand the complexity of the device and how it's going to be used in a real world situation. And very often, you're even going to need to do preclinical animal in vivo testing in order to demonstrate the more complex nuances of biocompatibility and the feasibility of using that implant in an actual biological environment. And now, a quick primer on some of the approval or clearance pathways that the FDA grants for some of our more complex medical devices. A lot of these aren't going to pertain to tongue depressors, walking canes, things that are generally thought of as low risk. But if you have somewhat of a moderate to high risk device, you're going to have to go through any of these four pathways. The big one is the pre-market approval pathway, which is reserved for high risk or what we call class 3 devices. In order to get that approval, you're going to need extensive clinical pathway. It's almost a given that if you're going through the PMA process, you're going to have to do clinical trials in a robust, powered, pivotal study that's going to determine your approval. You also need a lot of non-clinical data in addition to that, or even to get to that point. So benchtop testing, animal studies, biocompatibility, manufacturing, sterilization, validation studies. You need to demonstrate a robust QMS system and have compliance with the regulatory standards within that. And you almost always have to do an IDE that's going to give you the permission to do the clinical trials in the first place. And it's only in very select cases where if you still qualify as a high-risk device, but can be exempt from clinical trials for any number of justifications, that you might not need that. The 510K process is a less rigorous pathway. It's used for moderate risk devices, aka class 2 devices, that can claim substantial equivalence to already marketed predicate devices, meaning there's already a device on the market that you can argue is similar enough to yours in both its technological considerations and also the intended population that it's going to be used for. And you can argue that, therefore, you are equivalent to that device. So therefore, it's an argument saying you're just as safe as other devices, not necessarily that your device is, in absolute terms, safe and effective. Now, the data needed to that is anything that can demonstrate substantial equivalence to that prior device. So you're no longer talking strictly on efficacy and safety per se. It's simply equivalence testing to those predicate devices. And you might do that with definitely benchtop performance tests, sometimes animal studies. You almost certainly have to do biocompatibility studies and certain types of risk analyses that showed you've thought through any potential differences or risks inherent to your device. And you might have to do an IDE, particularly if clinical data is required. Uh, of course, if clinical data is required. But again, there might be pathways to justify not having to do those. Some lesser common pathways would be the de novo classification request, which is where you have a first of its kind novel device, which under normal circumstances would automatically subject you to the pre-market approval pathway. But if you can justify that this is inherently a low-risk device despite being brand new, then you can go through this less rigorous pathway. So you might have to do clinical data if it's applicable to that particular device. Very often you can get away with just doing non-clinical, meaning non-human benchtop testing, sometimes animal studies or leveraging animal studies from other prior devices. You almost certainly have to do biocompatibility data. And then similar to the 510(k) pathway, certain risk analyses studies in order to justify the risk level of your device. If you do have to do clinical data, it's usually a much smaller cohort compared to a statistically powered PMA pathway. And if you do that, you do have to do an IDE. And then the last pathway would be the humanitarian device exemption. That's where it still might be what would be considered a high-risk device, but if the condition it's used to treat is considered rare, and in fact so rare that it might be difficult to even find patients to do a robust clinical study, then you can usually argue that you might be exempt for some of those conditions, and you might not have to do those. So therefore, it still represents a high-risk device, but it's usually the allowance of the FDA to say, okay, we don't think you could feasibly do what we would ordinarily require for a PMA pathway, and yet the benefits of treating such a rare condition outweigh the inherent risks that we have really yet to understand. They'll allow you for a pathway to do less rigorous testing just based on the lack of availability of patients in order to do those. Now, in order to do whatever limited subset of that clinical study that you would have to do, you would still need that IDE. So one of the main points that I'm trying to get across here is that for all four of these pathways, the IDE process or collection of benchtop testing, biocompatibility testing, and whatnot represent a significant milestone in going about these pathways. Usually it's a huge milestone to go from that preclinical setting, that benchtop testing and animal setting, to then graduate to any potential necessary clinical testing that might be required, or the testing that will be otherwise required to get the ID in the first place might be all that you need in order to actually get clearance or approval, like in the case of the 510(k) pathway, or maybe the de novo classification or HDE pathway, where you might not have to do clinical trials at all. The data that you would otherwise need for that IDE represents that clearance or approval pathway in itself. Now, despite the IDE representing such a pivotal time in a medical device company's submission process to the FDA on their path towards getting clearance or approval, it used to be that companies just had to gather all this massive amount of testing and documentation, submit it to the FDA, and then cross their fingers and hope for the best. And that would be the first time that after many months of review, when the FDA came back, that was the first time they ever got any kind of insight from the FDA on if this is at all what the regulatory body was looking for. And very often they would get criticisms, deficiencies, or feedback to show that the companies and the FDA were not at all in line, which caused both a lot of time spent by the regulatory bodies communicating miscommunications with the company, and then the company for the first time understanding what they really had to do towards the process of approval or clearance of their medical device. So therefore, at the recommendation of a few committees to understand and work through this process, both through congressional acts and amendments, and then understanding how the regulatory bodies might behave differently, the FDA came up with a pre-IDE process after 1995 so that the FDA could actually give feedback to the companies on what would be expected knowing the unique considerations or designs of that particularly pitched medical device. Now, from that, and due to the popularity and getting that early feedback before there's any submission of any documentation, the FDA started to expand upon that programs into what we now call the Q submission programs, which is a variety of different uh, notifications or communication methods that we'll talk about in the coming slides. And then even further expanding upon that to have other interactive sessions with the FDA. The entire purpose being to get the medical device companies and the FDA on the same page and to have a coherent set of expectations that are unique to that particular medical device, so that when companies submit their documentations, both sides will be on the same page as far as their expectations. Now, the Q submission process, and I'll explain a little bit why it's called Q, has a few variety of different communication methods. So I'll spend a little time talking about the main one, which is the pre-submission process, and a few others that might be utilized in the history or the pathway of the medical device company pursuing these. Now, the pre-sub, which I often hear is being synonymous with the Q-sub process, so much that Q-sub and pre-sub are sometimes even used interchangeable, stands for pre-submission, and is the main pathway for a medical device company to get feedback prior to any intended submission for any of those pathways that might require an IDE. So including the pre-market approval, 510K, the humanitarian device exemption, and the de novo pathway, and also applicable to their analogous drug and biological requests. The main purpose of these is to improve the quality of the documents being submitted to that ultimate submission. It's intended to shorten review time so that the regulatory bodies, the FDA, already has a good understanding of what to expect from some of these, and also to lessen their time with overly burdensome or unnecessary testing that might have been done and potentially not have been applicable or relevant to that particular submission process. And also, in order to shorten all those, it's to develop and facilitate the development of new devices. A lot of companies were simply failing at that step because of the differences in expectations between the medical device companies and the regulatory bodies. Any misunderstandings results in lost time and lost money and a lot of failure of medical devices because of that lack of understanding. It's important to know that the pre-sub is entirely voluntary for the submitter. I would think it'd be naive to assume you could get away with not having to do this unless you had a robust history with a line of products already from that same company and you knew exact expectations based on your historical submissions with the regulatory body. For a brand new medical device startup, I almost would want to say that it'd be incredibly naive not to go through the pre-sub process. Now, the feedback that the FDA gives is not binding in any kind of legal sense, but the subsequent submissions should include discussions on why different approaches were taken, and it's always up to the purview of the medical device company who knows the most about their particular medical device to justify maybe why any choices were made. From the point of the FDA, any interactions provided within the pre-sub process are going to contribute to a more efficient and transparent review for the FDA and the submitter. And in line with the purpose of the pre-sub process, any feedback that's expected to be gotten from the FDA is most effective when requested prior to executing a planned line of testing. Now, moving on, another type of official interaction with the FDA might come in the form of a submission issue request, which happens after some pivotal submission period, like applying for an IDE, where a medical device manufacturer is requesting specific feedback from the FDA in the form of either written feedback or a meeting, and that has to be requested by the device company, on any proposed approaches to address deficiencies within the submission process. So that way, whenever the FDA has requested their specific deficiencies or limitations with the submission that have been made with them, the company and the FDA can come to a quick agreement on how best to resolve those. So, for instance, if a company were to receive, quote, additional information needed for one of their 510Ks, de novo requests, et cetera, or it might be in the form of a major deficiency, which is what's going to hold up the approval of an IDE until a company addresses that. Or it could be one of the decisions that FDA comes in. You make your final submission process for a pre-market approval, and the FDA comes back with not approvable. And they'll say why it's not approvable. And all those whys or deficiencies are forms that the company needs to resolve in order to somehow make it approvable. There might also be sort of contingencies. Hey, this is approvable, granted you provide insights on these deficiencies, or maybe approval pending GMP, which means, hey, we like all your data, we like all your preclinical and clinical testing. We just need to go through the auditing process on the good manufacturing practices that you have in place for making a safe product now that you're graduating from clinical to post-approval status. An SIR is not intended to be preview of a formal response, as in you're not going to discuss your pathway and the FDA said, hey, yeah, absolutely, we'll accept that, do that, and we'll be good. You'll never get the FDA to agree to something like that in even an official meeting like this. Usually you have to do robust testing to resolve a deficiency. You can talk about general strategies and expectations with the FDA, but it's going to be a lot more formal process for the FDA to review that following an official submission of those testings in order to understand if that data is robust enough to be enough to satisfy that requirement. As also, an SIR is not necessary for just simple clarification issues. These can often be handled just through simple email or a quick phone call or meeting that isn't necessarily an SIR. There are other minor types of meetings throughout the Q submission process that may or may not be applicable for a medical device company. And they might, again, opt to not do any of these if they don't deem it necessary. There is a type of study risk determination meetings that determines whether or not you might need an IDE at all. You can do certain testing within humans if the medical device in question poses no significant risks. It might be exempt from an IDE even though you are testing on humans. There are also what are called informational meetings that are great preparatory meetings that aren't taking the form of any kind of feedback session. They're simply to inform the FDA on information about the medical device. So it's a little bit more of a one-way street in order to help the FDA understand the future context of, or the context of any future Q sub or submission processes. These are particularly helpful as medical devices get more and more complex that require a lot more background knowledge in order for the FDA to make informed decisions or give informed feedback during, for instance, a pre-submission meeting. There are other required meetings that are attached to the PMA process, such as a determination meeting, whether or not your medical device is classified or would be applicable to the PMA process, an agreement meeting, or the day 100 meeting that are somewhat status update meetings for the FDA as you're going about this rigorous process. There are even certain meetings, such as the breakthrough device designation meeting, that if your device qualifies as something novel enough to be considered a breakthrough that has a high potential to help a lot of people through potentially less rigorous means, if you qualify through the breakthrough device designation process, you can have expedited meetings with the FDA, quicker turnarounds on data, or the pre-submission process. Very helpful and applicable to any medical device startups that don't have the funding to wait for a typical 1 year or 6-month turnaround on any data that they submit. There are other meeting types that fall outside the purview of the Q-Sub process, but helpful to understand how companies actually interact with the FDA. There's requests for emergency use authorizations, which we heard a lot about during the COVID vaccine process. There's requests for designations. Some complex medical devices or combinational drugs that have both the device and drug component have to be determined whether or not which of the 3 divisions of the FDA that handles separately devices, biologics, and drugs will handle the regulatory process. So if you have a device or a drug-eluting medical device that might fall in the purview of 1, 2, or 3 of those, you can request a designation by the FDA to understand and even make an argument for which division you think would be most applicable to that device. There's administrative questions regarding the submission process. Those can even be handled through simple emails, telephone calls. You can talk with the program director for the division that you think you'll be applying to. And any requests on clarification on device-specific guidance, what standards will be applicable, that are not specific to your medical device development, but are more general questions, again, can be resolved through simple email or telephone conversations with the program manager or the director of that division. Now, one of the benefits of the Q-Sub process from the FDA's purpose is to create a track record of that communication regarding that medical device with the FDA. So these aren't just informational meetings or something to benefit purely the medical device company. It's something to help the FDA also understand and keep track of that line of communications. A lot of these are somewhat agreements, if not legally binding, with the FDA to come to that mutual understandings between the FDA and the company. So it's to the benefit of the FDA to keep track of that, just like it is with the medical device company. So Q-subs are one of those administrative tools that keep a record of the official interactions between the two parties. Now, one of the reasons they're called the Q-sub process is that the tracking tool always starts with this Q letter. And forgive me, I tried spending a good amount of time figuring out why it's the letter Q. I don't know. But whenever you start and initiate that process, you're going to be given a Q sub tracking number that starts with Q and then the 2-digit year followed by a 4-digit numerical sequence that just comes in the chronological order of the requests that were received from that calendar year. So for instance, Q2500001 represents the very first Q sub communication process within 2025 with the FDA that year. Now, as you have subsequent follow-ups, and you can have many different pre-subs, informational sessions, amendments to anything that you're doing throughout that submission process, you have other designations that get tacked on to that original Q nomenclature. So for instance, supplements are used to request additional feedback related to an original Q sub will lead to a /S001 for your first subsequent supplement interaction. As you make submissions for your documentation to, for instance, get an IDE or an approval, you might be hit with deficiencies, and therefore you might need to add missing data or correct errors within that package, in which case you'll be given an amendment number that gets tacked onto that. And so, for instance, you could have this long flowing pathway where you first have your informational meeting, then you supplement that with an official pre-sub. Then you maybe do your study risk determination, which is your second supplement to that original Q sub number. And then you have, after you're submitting some document, you have to amend those because you have a correction to your study risk determination. So the very end of it, you might have Q25001, supplement number 2, amendment number 1, tacked on this official communication. And whenever you email and submit these back and forth with the FDA, you use these numbers in all the subject headings or the bodies of the emails, your cover letters, so the FDA can keep track and know appropriately where to file it on their end. Now, generally, prior to a pre-sub meeting, a company will provide necessary documents related to the medical device. They'll supply an agenda and then requested feedback in the form of questions related to the type of feedback that they're looking to get from the FDA. The FDA will then provide written feedback and any questions or clarifications on any of those points. Then the actual pre-sub meeting will be held to discuss that feedback, the written comments, and any clarifications that the FDA might be requesting or the medical device is looking to get from the FDA. Now, the format of the pre-submission process generally takes the form of a teleconference. This has been the main preference of the FDA, particularly since the rise of Zoom and Microsoft Teams from the COVID pandemic, and is a lot more convenient than any in-person meetings, which used to be actually quite common in prior years. They're limited to 1 hour, and the company has to provide the agenda and is responsible for assuring that the meeting stays on the allotted time scale. So someone within the company has to decide on the 5 bullet point items that they need feedback on, for instance, and they have to make sure that they stay within that hour and keep track of that time throughout that process. The FDA is incredibly busy and will cut the company off after that 1 hour. And should the company fail to get the requested feedback that they want on all their requested items, that's to the fault of the company. So it's important that someone from the company keeps the agenda going and the meeting on track to make sure all points are hit. For attendees, usually it's in any kind of requested letter for a pre-submission meeting. The FDA needs to know what representative experts that they need to pull onto the meeting so that they can give the required feedback, whether it's expertise in biocompatibility into clinical study designs or an animal study design, you want to let the FDA know what kind of feedback you're requesting so that they can pull the representative experts on their side and provide the type of feedback necessary. The company, on the other hand, is free to invite whoever they want. Relevant stakeholders are often very commonly invited to understand exactly what the regulatory hurdles might be. And then the company has to themselves define who's responsible for participating in these meetings, who's going to talk on what point, who's going to specifically ask for what feedback item. So they're the ones kind of running the show, the medical device company. Now, the company is also responsible for maintaining the meeting minutes of the company, which are going to represent the formal log of whatever decisions came about throughout that meeting. In fact, it's something that they have to submit within 15 days to the FDA as part of the official Q sub log process. And the FDA then is going to have a chance to agree to those meeting minutes or maybe ask for amendments with that company because it does represent some type of non-binding agreements between the two. Those meeting minutes themselves shouldn't be a transcript, but simply a summary of the discussions, particularly on any relevant decisions or feedback that was given on any particular issue. Now, there's some strict timelines that the FDA needs to adhere to when undergoing the pre-sub process, or the Q-sub process in general. For instance, when a medical device company is requesting a pre-sub meeting with both a teleconference and written feedback, the FDA has to either supply written feedback in advance of the meeting, either within 5 days of any scheduled meeting date. That means if it's happening sooner than 70 days, they have to supply that before the meeting so that the company has time to review that, or at a maximum of 70 days. So whichever one comes first. It can be very often that the FDA, due to busy schedules and in trying to schedule that teleconference meeting, that might happen 90 days after a request is made. But still, the FDA in those cases is obligated to provide written feedback by day 70 and can't wait those additional days. If for some reason the meeting is scheduled a little bit sooner in advance, a company can't be blindsided with anything the FDA provides in that meeting. In order to prevent that, they have to provide written feedback at the very least of 5 days prior to that meeting. If a company wants to skip the teleconference process and only get written feedback, that's just going to be gone within 70 days. There's somewhat similar processes with an SIR or submission issue request. Because the feedback is going to take the form of either a teleconference meeting or written feedback, not both, like in the case with the pre-sub, the FDA has a timeline that's dictated by when the medical device company seeks that submission issue request. If the request is received within 60 days of receiving the approval or disapproval or deficiency notification, then the company is going to get feedback from the FDA within 21 days of that SIR. If it's past that 60 days mark, then that gives the FDA a lot more leeway. They're going to have a maximum of 70 days to respond. Similar timelines are for the study risk determination, where they're going to receive a formal letter from the FDA within 90 days of that request. For an information meeting, it's going to be a scheduled meeting within 90 days of that request. In my experience with the FDA is almost inevitably going to be taking the maximum timeline allotted to them. So typically that 90 days, that 70 days, that 21 days is dictated by these timelines, and not very often are you going to get it sooner. Now, in all cases, you're requesting feedback from the FDA. You have to have guided feedback and request quality feedback from the FDA. So some good feedback tips might be that you might want to request specific feedback on a provider proposal as opposed to trying to verbally go through your proposal in a meeting. That's why you want to give that information in advance. You want to have done your homework on any applicable references or published literature that give insight to whatever the FDA might be utilizing on their end to understand any risks or benefits to any types of study designs or methodology. The company wants to clearly articulate their desired outcome, including what they intend to use the medical device for, meaning their indications or labeled uses, because a lot of times that's going to dictate what type of studies or what you're including, your inclusion population is going to be. And finally, you want to make the pre-sub process an initiation of a multi-step process towards a device approval pathway. Despite having informational sessions available to you where you might just want to ask more broad questions to the FDA, you want to make sure the requested feedback is aligned to help you prepare for future submissions. Now, the guidance document to the pre-sub process or the Q submission process that the FDA undergoes provides a pretty rich list of not recommended questions or poor quality feedback requests that aren't going to get much uh, back and forth with the FDA. So, any kind of questions that pertain to trying to get to the FDA to commit to the outcomes of an IDE or approval request are likely not going to get much on the end from the FDA. So, for instance, if you were to say, hey, will an IDE that include results from the proposed testing be approved? You're not going to get the FDA to come in and say, yes, we will approve that and have something in such rigid terms. The FDA is always going to say, hey, the data is the data. We're going to have to wait and see what kind of results you get. And the complexity that arises from tests may indicate something that might go towards approval, but also might raise new risks. So you're never going to get the FDA to commit to an answer for a question like that. And whenever requesting study designs, the FDA is always going to take the position that you, the medical device company, know much more about your device and the current literature and your competitors than what the FDA knows. So, for instance, a question like, what should my clinical study design be? Very often, the FDA is just going to kick that back and say, hey, you have to propose something and we can give feedback on that. We can't recommend something for you. We just don't have the expertise. And lastly, open-ended questions such as, does the FDA have any other feedback, is likely not going to be met with any kind of success. The whole purpose of the pre-sub process is to get guided feedback on specific questions that the medical device company wants. The FDA doesn't have an inherent interest in the medical device company or their success, so they're not going to have any other feedback based on this. They are there to help, but it's up to the company to request specific feedback. The guidance document on the Q-Sub process published by the FDA has some pretty great resources. There's a pre-submission acceptance checklist, something you as a medical device company want to go through as you're going through the submission process. And they have even example documentation on how the meeting minutes should look that you're inevitably required to submit back to the FDA as part of that documentation process. So please check those out in addition to more examples of good questions and bad feedback questions to ask whenever going throughout this process. So with that in mind, hopefully that's provided some good, valuable resources and history and motivation of the FDA for having such communication processes. Hopefully this module even will demystify the process in communicating with the FDA. Hopefully, this goes to show that the FDA is there to help medical device companies. They want them to be successful. They want to reduce any miscommunications and make sure both sides are on the same page when trying to submit and go for a successful submission. So, as a medical device company, you should utilize these resources to make the most out of what you can get out of the submission process and to get the most out of your understanding of the expectations with a regulatory body like the FDA. Best of luck in your submissions.